And this podcast is called Changing the Course. And we've been transparent and authentic in what we are promoting as an organization. And right now we are promoting ourselves as being an anti-racist organization.
Yeah.
And restorative practices is our approach and a mindset that we've adopted to ensure that we are working and walking the talk of being anti-racist, with restorative practices being the tool. If we didn't bring in restorative practices and adopt that as a mindset, will we truly be able to be anti-racist as an organization?
No, not even close. Like what is that? If you're not addressing what is anti-racism? So let's begin that, right? So this construct of racism and racialized oppression that is a byproduct of human trafficking. The myths that we were taught is, racism is here because people aren't kind, or racism is here because people don't know, because they're xenophobic. No, racism, that construct as we know it. Difference existed before the transatlantic slave trade. Oppression existed. Gender discrimination existed before that. But the construct of conflating folks into racialized ideas and giving them some natural inclination connected to that race, that's a byproduct of a capitalist move to traffic human beings, right? If you want to know, look up Gomez Eanes de Zurara, who was the chief chronicler of Portugal at the time. He wrote a book about Prince Henry the Navigator. He was the first person to codify in text Afro-pessimism, this belief that because you are African, that slavery is somehow better than you being free, right? So that construct of race and racialization that we know was birthed from human trafficking. It was birthed from exploitation. So if I am anti-racist, my work is to find the exploitation, right? We teach a framework called anti-racist restorative practice, where we first acknowledge that within our systems and with our institutions that racism has been at play, or racialized oppression. You say, Terrence, why do you keep saying racialized oppression? Because when we hear racism, we think about melanin. We think skin. But when you think about racialized oppression, that's when you're conferring some resource or some access based on someone's identity. So racialized oppression happens because you're queer. It happens because you are woman identified. It happens because English is your second language, or you may have a different nationality. So all those constructs of racialized oppression are really centered on one thing. This group should be preferred because of their identity. This group should be exploited. That is a myth of human hierarchy. So if I'm responding to this myth of human hierarchy and saying I am an anti-racist, but I'm not trying to restore relationships, restore spaces, confront institutional practices and policies that harm exploited peoples, those things can't exist. I can't say I'm anti-racist, but then be zero tolerance. I can't say I'm anti-racist and then not have restorative practice. Yeah. Those things cannot exist within themselves. So what you have now is you have all these folks that read, even Kennedy's book, How to Be Anti-Racist, and they're like, yep, I got my How to Be Anti-Racist, t-shirt, and that wasn't his intent, And I have people that may not agree with everything in that book, but the real is this: if you want to be anti-racist, then you have to seek out, right? When we said acts, when I talked about that framework of anti-racist restorative practice, the how of that framework begins with acknowledging, then it turns to centering and turning. Centering the lived experience of those who've actually experienced the harm, and turning them and saying, what can we do to make this space better? Now, I'm not saying you go to the one black person that you have on your staff and be like, yo, this has been pretty racist, what should we do? Mm-hmm. There's books, texts, there's all different ways where people of color or marginalized folks have said, this is what we need to affirm our identity, affirm our humanity, et cetera, right? There's brilliant, from bell hooks to a list of different folks that you can read and get that information. But after we acknowledge that racism and racialized oppression are in our systems, and we center the lived experience of those that are in our systems and turn to them, we then need to seek. We got to seek out those practices that are harmful, and we have to abolish those practices. But abolition is not about breaking things down. It's about what we seek to build. So if I tear down the policies or I tear down the practice, but I haven't done the creative work of building a space that curates safe space for human beings, then I'm not really doing the work of abolition. So that's what needs to happen. So you cannot be anti-racist, but be anti-restorative. No, that's racist. Because how do we hold the institutions accountable for the harm they've already done? See, we sometimes think about this moment and we say, oh, in this particular moment, we're anti-racist. and we're going to start fresh from zero. But that's not the real. The babies that walk into your school in North Lawndale, in Inglewood, and the different communities here in Chicago, they're not just walking into school with just their context. There's intergenerational harm that they have in their backpack that they're walking in with. And how do I know? Because some of them are walking through disinvested communities. And when they come into a school, not only do I have my experience that I'm carrying with me, I got my uncle's experience, my auntie's experience, my mama's experience. And if they were all dehumanized in their spaces, so restorative practice is not just how do I respond when a child misbehaves. It's how do I fix systems to create safe spaces for human beings. I can't be anti-racist if I'm not focused on fixing systems to create healing, healthy, and affirming spaces for human beings.
We typically do a session in our podcast in which we get down to practice, but I would argue that like our conversation today was full of the why, the how, and how to get down to practice. So I want to thank you, Terrence. I want to thank you, Dr. Spicer, for joining Changing the Course today. I want to thank you for bringing your expertise into our noble space with our culture teams and working alongside Dr. Jan to ensure that our culture teams have the training that they need to go back into their schools to continue to push this work for the betterment of our students. Before we go, we always have our guests read our grinding quote, which is by Bettina Love.
To love all children, we must struggle together to create the schools we are taught to believe are impossible.
Schools built on justice, love, joy, and anti-racism.
Gentlemen, I appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Blessings to you and gratitude.
Thank you to your audience. Thank you.
Appreciate y'all for listening.